Hello and welcome to the Colchester Podcast with Martin Goss. My name's Craig Fuchs. We are now 28th of May. We're just a few days after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced the general election. Very busy time for Martin as he started campaigning for the general election. And so we're going to do a shorter episode of the podcast today to talk about Martin's campaign to become Colchester's next MP. So thanks again, Martin, for making the time to talk to our viewers and listeners. I suppose before we get into it about policy and the usual political stuff that people, I'd imagine, are getting rammed through their letterboxes and down their screens, the important question really to answer is more about you as a person, why people would vote for you in a general election. And I think just before we get into that, it's important, I think, to talk about our political system in that we vote for an MP to represent us in Parliament that happens to be a part of a political party. So the question, Martin, is why you?
Great question, and I've got a very straightforward answer. If you recall the fact that Bob Russell was our MP for 18 years, for the majority of that, he wasn't part of government. He was part of Colchester. He stood up for Colchester. He did things and delivered for Colchester over 18 years before we had the change in 2015 and it became Will Quince for the last 9 years, who obviously is standing down. And the challenge I put back to people is you've tested, not everybody, but a lot of people in Colchester will know Bob, will have interacted with him, and then you'd have had up to 18 years to interact with him as MP. Obviously, he was a councillor, council leader, mayor, etc. before that. You've then had 9 years of Will Quince, who was a minister, he was part of government. And I'm pushing back to people of Colchester where they have to ask themselves, which MP delivered more for Colchester? Did they feel that a local person that lives here, was born here, grew up here, worked here, did more for the city than somebody that moved here, because Will Quince did? Yes, he's now a resident of Colchester, absolutely, but he was parachuted in to this seat, and he's also held various ministerial positions in government. And when he was standing for election, his clear message to people was, if I'm at the heart of government, this is from his own literature, basically I'll do more for Colchester. And I think people need to move away from just blindly looking at the party, and they need to look at the person who's going to deliver for Colchester. And I think that's the very clear message that I'm coming out with, that I have lived here for 46 years. So out of all the candidates, I've got the longest tenure in terms of actually living in the city. I've obviously been to school here, I've grown up here, I've worked here. I know what makes the place tick. I know what the challenges are, because what affects residents here affect me because I live here. So all the same potholes, congestion issues, infrastructure issues, the things that, you know, come up at a more local level, although some of it maps back to government and government funding or lack of government funding in terms of potholes, because we've got more potholes in the UK at this moment in time than I think we've ever had because of lack of funding, and all councils are saying this. It's about time we had some honesty around these things. But my clear message is, which MP performed better, which did better for Colchester, and therefore, if you liked the more local person who wasn't part of government for the majority of their career, then that proves that a local person that's got a proven track record, given that I've obviously come through the same apprenticeship route that Bob Russell did, where I've served the city for 16 years, and dealt with lots of issues and thousands of bits of casework. It's the same route Bob came. And people have to ask, which MP delivered more? And I think that's a really clear message to the electorate, that actually you can have a local person that isn't necessarily going to be part of the next government, although saying that, there is current conjecture that we're looking at a hung parliament, but who knows till the votes are cast. You know, we've got another 5 to 6 weeks to go until they're counted, and opinion polls don't always deliver what people expect, and they can change. But that's my clear message. I've got a track record. I've lived here. I've grown up here. And that was successful for Colchester for 18 years because people kept voting for it in terms of Bob, and they knew he put Colchester first and didn't necessarily vote with how the party expected him to vote. So a good example is tuition fees. He refused to vote for that because he signed a pledge. We've got the University of Essex, really good university that's grown, really key to our future growth of education and our students and our employment in the future by growing more technical skills, etc., and healthcare, all the great things they do. I've spent a lot of time there finding more and more about what they do because it's just so diverse. And I think that's the clear message to people. You know, obviously the Liberal Democrats have got some really, really good national policies, properly costed, which are of interest to people. Things around the NHS, around the environment, around dealing with burglaries and the police. So there's some really solid stuff there, which obviously we can talk about. But my message is I'm local, I can deliver and I will deliver. And therefore it gives people something different to vote for. And I will always put Colchester first. And I think that's a really simple message.
So at the moment, we've got the current kind of prediction of the political landscape is, from my take on it, is that this really is the end for the Conservative Party in its current form, in that they will be leaving government because people have had enough. They're not happy with the COVID response, and they're not happy with the economy and perhaps the cost of living crisis and how it's all been managed. And that the general election was seemingly called off the back of more or less negative outlook from the Bank of England, which the Prime Minister was looking to take almost some credit for, and that people are very disillusioned with the feedback that you've told me in earlier episodes when you've been talking to people, is that people have become very disillusioned with the Conservative Party's long-standing dyed-in-the-wool Conservative Party supporters. That therefore it would seem that there is going to be a change of government, and there is opinion polls and outlook to say that we could have a Labour landslide, or it could be a hung parliament, or some other outcome. What would you say to someone who is looking at their choice come election day, that might be historically a Conservative supporter, that perhaps doesn't have the same trust or faith in Labour, and is considering a vote for something different in the Liberal Democrats? But historically, or certainly in modern times, we have had a two-party system where, certainly in our lifetimes, I'm sure, that it has always been a Labour government or a Conservative government, and that at what is a very volatile and tricky time, to try something completely new and to put the Liberal Democrats into bat where there isn't kind of the experience. What would you say to that person?
So I think the message is quite clear that the Liberal Democrats will win a lot more seats at this election. There's definitely a prediction that we should get at least 40 MPs, if not more. But again, until all the votes are cast and counted, you know, nobody knows the true result. But we're certainly potentially going to be the third biggest party again, which is great, which means we get more media time, etc. But in terms of why would people vote Liberal Democrat over other parties? Because you are right, it tends to be more of a two-party state. It should be people vote for what they want. And more people I've been speaking to want to actually vote for the person that's going to represent them, not the party. And that's certainly been coming across quite strongly. And given that I am known across the city because of, you know, the length of time that I've served, that is quite helpful, because hopefully most people will have had a good positive experience. Can't please everybody, and therefore people will know exactly what they can expect when coming to me with an issue and me trying to help or deal with it or advise. And that's what they expect from their MP. And that is exactly what they'll get, because I've got the experience already, and it can therefore be built on at a more national level to represent Colchester in Westminster properly, but also represent residents that ultimately are the voters. So that's exactly what they will get from me.
How important realistically is your political experience?
Huge, because you're not electing a novice in terms of knowing how to navigate government, because I have obviously dealt with some things at a national level, and interfaced with chief executives of many organisations, and obviously MPs do that. I've met businesses, charities, etc. So I'm already doing some of the stuff that MPs do to represent their cities locally or to deal with things at a more national level. And I think it's understanding how legislation works at a national level, but how it affects you locally. If the legislation has got holes in it, then that affects what councils can do and what you can deliver more locally to residents. Therefore, MPs have a huge, huge responsibility to make sure when legislation is going through Parliament, they A, understand what that legislation really means, and B, try to spot any holes in it. Because legislation can be big and complicated, and a bit like when HMRC changed tax rules and tax law gets changed by government, somebody always finds a way to work around it through a loophole where somebody has not worked out a possible workaround, as you call it in IT terms. And I think if you've got no idea and no experience, and you're going into Parliament brand new with none of that expertise or background, you're going to be lost very, very quickly. And I think that's where MPs get voted in or they become ministers. It's a bit like Steve Webb was the Lib Dem pensions minister back in the coalition. He was the only minister that ever actually understood pensions, because that's what he did for a living. And you know how complicated that is from your own previous background, but he actually understood it. So when legislation was being drafted or was being looked at to close loopholes or make it more tax efficient or whatever was done in that period, he actually drove it from experience and his own background. And that, I think, is one of the things that has been lacking in government, is that somebody might be in charge of something, but they've got absolutely no clue or experience about it.
Well, I'm sure it won't be a surprise to anybody watching. What I'm kind of alluding to is that we have yourself as somebody that's been in local politics and local government for a long time. We have another of the candidates who is also a local politician, and then we have somebody, to my understanding, that has no local political experience, that they are highly regarded in terms of their sporting achievements and other achievements in James Cracknell, that doesn't have the breadth or the depth of political experience that you or the Labour candidate might have.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That is true. And I think the people of Colchester are seeing straight through that, and it is coming out on the doors again. You know, the comment that comes up time and time again is, what is Mr. Cracknell actually doing here? What relationship does he have with Colchester? And why was he selected? I think people are quite miffed that the Tory party in Colchester has not selected a local candidate, or at least somebody more local, or maybe with a more close-fitting background. And that comes up time and time again, and that's costing them votes, even from members of the Conservative Party, you know, that feel strongly about it. And that means, I think, that people will certainly not be voting Conservative for a huge number of reasons, but that will just be added to the list, which means that will cost them even more votes than they're currently losing on a daily basis.
What would you say to somebody who is, because obviously James Cracknell's achievements are there are many of them in his sporting life and his recovery from injury and other aspects. You know, it's a very impressive CV. It isn't a political CV. It is, you know, it is impressive nonetheless. What would you say to somebody who is thinking, well, this is clearly somebody that can drive stuff through. Why not give him a go to see what he can do politically?
Because I think being a professional sports individual versus maybe coming from a more commercial background where you've worked in industry or commerce or finance, I think that experience is more important, particularly in Westminster. And absolutely, yeah, many great achievements there for the country, and you know, hats off and praise across all of those things. But it's a bit like asking somebody that is not a sportsman or sports person to suddenly, you know, go and play professionally or do that. I'm not, you know, I'm not particularly brilliant at football or anything like that, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily find me playing it.
No, in psychology, it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah,
is that before you've done something, it looks like it would be easy to do and that you'd be excellent at it. But it's not until you actually get into what it is you're doing and realise just how complicated and subtle and nuanced it is, and that you don't have any experience in that field. And my opinion, my personal opinion, is that is what we're seeing with James Cracknell, is that because he is clearly excellent in his chosen field, that it would appear that many human beings would go, well, if I was good at that, I'll be good at this. And that's just not how it works.
No, you're absolutely right. It doesn't mean you're good at everything. We all have strengths and weaknesses. You know, it's a bit like my DIY is not the greatest. I wouldn't suddenly come around yours and claim to be a tradesperson, because you might end up with a couple of wonky shelves, which I'm sure you wouldn't want. So
you know, better than my attempt.
So yeah, it's about playing to your strengths and being qualified to carry on doing your service for people, and I would suggest that certainly I'm probably stronger qualified, frankly.
Yeah, well, I think you summarised it, and I think most people watching will be able to get an understanding of that. That you have had hands-on experience in how the government legislation filters down and impacts at local level. And you touched on things like potholes and funding and the like. You know how that system works from Colchester City to Essex County Council and then to government and beyond. And that's a very, very important topic. To simply say, as we talked about before on the podcast, that it's possible somehow, as your competition are doing, that they're just going to get all the potholes fixed and they're just going to get the infrastructure sorted. Doesn't actually work like that in practice, does it?
No, not at all, because actually, if the funding's not there, you can't fix it. And currently, there is no funding. And now the government, in effect, will be dissolved in 48 hours or so. You know, there's going to be no change because we are in the election period. So what is set, and only the next government can start to look at that. But of course, it would have to be done through the budget. And they may call an emergency budget, or they may be held by the current spending plans, because the country has no money, frankly.
I think I saw a reference to there not being an emergency summer budget if Labour were to get in.
Yes, and I would expect that that's probably the case. But again, until all the votes are cast and whoever actually does take the reins of government, whether it is a different party, or which is highly likely, or it's a hung parliament, which is another possible outcome, we won't know all the facts. But you know, we've obviously got an election to run, and now it's up to the people to decide who they choose.
What was so let's talk about Liberal Democrat policy then, because I'm sure people, if they're considering their ballot, they are aware that there is all this speculation that it may be the Conservative Party leaving, and that there isn't the same level of, or certainly my experience, there doesn't seem to be the same level of support for Keir Starmer's Labour as there was for Jeremy Corbyn's. People were either emphatically supporting Jeremy Corbyn's Labour or couldn't stand him. He was very divisive, but he at least got people talking. Whereas I think people's view of Labour is that Keir Starmer is a bit of an also-ran. In terms of, so they may be weighing up between not only making a decision about their local MP, but also looking at what's behind them in terms of the party. So give us a kind of an overview briefly of what Lib Dems are considering for their manifesto. I know that it's standard that we don't see a manifesto fully for a couple of weeks, but where do you see that going?
Well, the biggest policy that we've been talking about sometime is the NHS. So just to give you some quick flavour around that, one of the things that is pledged and is deliverable is 8,000 new GPs, because we have not got enough GPs. In fact, we've got the lowest number of GPs in the country for a generation, because people are not going into the professional, they're retiring early because of the stress, because there's not enough GPs, therefore it's circular. So that is one of the headline pledges. The other pledge is to ensure that the appointment system allows you to actually see a GP within a week. Currently, if my experience is aligned with everyone else's, it's about 3 weeks before you even get to see a GP. We're saying it's a week. The other thing is around NHS dentist provision. There is none. And the biggest issue for this, having investigated it, is the fact that the NHS contracts are just not fit for purpose. And that's why people won't sign them, because they are not paying the market rate for doing work. And a good example is that you would get paid the same for doing 1 filling as you would for 4. And there's obviously a cost to that. So the dental contract is what dentists hold up as being the blocker for serving under the NHS, which they've happily done for many, many years, until the contracts got worse and worse and just did not pay for people. And therefore that capacity just disappeared. Not necessarily because of a lack of dentists, although there is also a recruitment drive to be done for that. It's the fact that it just doesn't pay to be an NHS dentist. And obviously people opt out, and patients have to go private, which many cannot afford to do for quite serious dental work, which is thousands and thousands of pounds. Unless you can afford it, you've heard of people having to self-serve their own dentistry, and some of the brutal things they've been forced to do, which I'm not even going to mention, but you read about them. And that's crazy in the 6th largest economy, that people are having to self-serve their own dentistry. It's almost going back to Victorian times, isn't it? It's absolutely brutal and awful. So again, having worked with dentists on this policy, we've said, what would bring you back to the NHS? And the biggest thing is renegotiate the contract, make it fair and accessible. And that is what we've committed to do. So that is at the heart of certainly our headline policies, because the NHS affects everybody. And the health of the nation affects so many other things, such as our well-being, people's ability to work and to serve the economy, and to make sure their families can actually put food on the table, can actually heat homes, and people can actually survive, with more and more people using food banks. So the NHS and the nation's health is a #1 priority in the Liberal Democrat manifesto, and certainly my #1 priority in Colchester, because health and NHS comes up time and time again.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else that we could expect to see in the Liberal Democrat manifesto?
Yeah, one of the other headlines we've mentioned and has been out in the public domain for some time is around burglaries. One of the biggest complaints that we get is that when there's a burglary, they never see a police officer. It never gets investigated. It's reported more for insurance purposes some of the time, and then it's closed. And that's the end of it. And the figures and detection rates in the UK around actually catching anyone for most of these burglaries, I think it's, a couple of percent people are caught for burglaries. So you're looking at high 98% of burglaries are just closed, and no one ever visits or does any forensics or anything. So the Liberal Democrats have committed to ensuring that all burglaries get some form of visit or recognition, so that they're not just closed, because that would push to higher detection rates and therefore drive down the burglaries and crime rates. If you think about it, if you literally do nothing and people think it's okay to shoplift or to burgle people's businesses, it's not just residential properties, businesses suffer thousands of pounds of losses where people break in, steal equipment, steal IT equipment, and they can't function because they've stolen everything. That's worth thousands of pounds. It's about detection. Prevention, of course, is #1, but detection, of course, is really key to get those criminals off the streets and to deal with that properly. And then finally, again, one of the biggest things around the environment is that we hear daily, almost, thanks to people like Fergal Sharkey, about the thousands of hours over the year of discharge of sewage into our rivers. And you heard about Lake Windermere recently, where there was yet another spillage into it. Anglian Water have certainly been pumping sewage into our local waterways. And in fact, Anglian Water were fined fairly recently as well. So the Liberal Democrat policy is to try and put a stop to that, to get rid of Ofwat, put in place new legislation to actually fine these companies properly, to tighten the grip on the ability to stop it so that they don't actually just think it's fine, we haven't got to invest money in infrastructure, we'll just let it go into the overflow and into our waterways to pollute them, because actually it's not going to cost us anything, so that's fine. The Liberal Democrats have said we will use legislation and a new public body to actually do something about this, because currently Ofwat and the Environment Agency is not doing anything around water companies, and they're getting away with it. They're almost self-certifying the disaster that they're causing, and this is allowed by the Environment Agency in legislation, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Only on the local newspaper in the last 24 hours, the headline was that somebody's got ill from bathing in the river. And no doubt that is linked back to what's being discharged into it, because it's no longer safe for people to go swimming in rivers. Because if you're in effect swimming with sewage, untreated raw sewage, so what comes from our households is ending up in rivers, that's significant for the environment, wildlife, and also for human beings and human health, public health. It's a real issue, and it's really becoming a huge issue with the public, because it's public health again, through lack of infrastructure funding by the private sector, and also through lack of legislation that really allows you to hold these companies to account. So they've got lazy, and they'll just let the sewage pump in because they've not invested in the infrastructure, and they get away with it. We would stop this.
Good. That's a really important topic for the drive for that is purely commercial, isn't it? It's purely profit led. That if you're a water company, then you should, and you are being paid, and we don't have any choice to pay for our water. We don't have any. They have a localized monopoly, don't they? I can't change from my water supply to another, and to operate a business practice like that is disgraceful, isn't it?
It is, but at least hopefully we'll get legislation to deal with it in the next Parliament, because currently the government has just allowed it to carry on. So let's keep today's episode quite short, because we'll do more of these in the run-up to the election itself. But is there anything else that you think is particularly relevant now as people start to think about who they're going to vote for, what it means to have the general election? I think people just need to ask themselves, what are they voting for? What is it you want from your next MP? And I think that's the clear question, the clear challenge I'm putting back to the voting public in Colchester. Vote for something different. Vote for something new that will put Colchester at the centre of what they do on behalf of the electorate that vote them in. And that is the clear message from me.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Craig.
And I'll look forward to speaking to you again in the run-up to the election. How very exciting.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, Martin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.